I want to talk to you today about an important question. What makes something good or bad? And I don't mean simply preferences. I mean morally good or morally evil. How do we know if an action is good with a capital G? Common answer is what? God said so. But the truth is, it's a much more complicated question. It's a question that was asked more than 2,000 years ago by the Greek philosopher Plato. One of his dialogues, Euthyphro, the main character, Socrates, is trying to understand the source of moral values. And one answer somebody gives him is that it's what the gods want. Notice gods, right? The Greeks were polytheistic. And the answer is it's what the gods want is good, and what they don't is bad. But Socrates rejects that definition for a simple reason. The gods want different things. One god says to do this, and another god says to do that. And sometimes those things conflict. So it's a problem in polytheistic world to link morality simply to what a god says. But that problem exists still in a monotheistic world. Right? I'm sure many of you are thinking, why does this matter? Abraham came along, he clarified, there's only one God. So there's one good and evil. There's one answer to the question of what is moral. It's what God says so. But that's what I want us to ask. Is something morally good or ethically good simply because God says so? It's an old joke. Moses came down the mountain with the tablets and announced to the people, I have good news and bad news. Good news is I bargained God down to just 10. The bad news is adultery is still on the list. I won't put anyone on the spot. I want to ask you to raise your hand. But who would think that adultery is morally ethical, even if it wasn't a commandment? Who would think that it would be permitted, that it's a good act, if it was left out of the list? Who needs the 10 Commandments to tell them murder is wrong? Theft is wrong. Happy I don't see any hands going up. But I want to take the question even further. What about the punishment for adultery? Is that moral because God said so? It's Leviticus 20:10. If a man commits adultery with a married woman committing adultery with another man's wife, Mot yamut hanoef anoefet. The adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. Is that punishment moral because the Torah says so? I once asked a fellow rabbinical student this question. It was an ongoing debate we had. And his response to me is that the Torah here is trying to teach us something. That adultery is such an extreme and egregious act that breaches not only the relationship but the community and values, that it's given such an extraordinarily strict punishment to teach us a lesson. It wasn't really an answer to my question though. So I asked, is it a moral punishment for somebody who commits adultery? And the answer was, walked back a bit more. Well, we don't really do it anymore. The rabbis eliminated this and other capital punishments long ago in the Talmud. They made all sorts of rules and restrictions. There have to be witnesses. There have to be witnesses that the person was warned. It has to be within a certain amount of time of the acts, that they knew what the punishment was. There has to be a Sanhedrin, all sorts of things that essentially eliminated capital punishment in Jewish law the rabbis instituted. So the rabbis abolished the rule. So again, that's not really an answer to the question. Is it or is it not a moral punishment? So I pushed them further. What if all of those standards were met? What if there was a Sanhedrin? What if there were witnesses to the crime? People were warned. There were witnesses to the warning. Every rabbinic enactment, requirement, all of the criteria, rabbinic and biblical, were met. Would the death penalty be morally deserving for somebody who committed adultery? And to his credit, he was honest. When put on the spot, his answer was, yes, the Torah says so, so it must be. I disagree with that answer, but I give him credit for being honest. Because I've asked that question many times to rabbis, rabbinical students, to people in general, and more often than not, I don't get a straight answer. I get a lot of non-answers. But it's an important question. It's one we should all be asking because it gets right to the center of what's possibly the most essential philosophical and religious question there is. What makes something right or wrong? What is the source of morality and ethics? And this isn't some far-off academic discussion like much of philosophy can be. I enjoy philosophy very much, you know that, but I get much of it is maybe not so practical in many people's minds. But this gets at some of the most important issues of the day. Conversations about abortion, the death penalty, euthanasia. It gets to questions that we're going to face very soon in the future about population control, artificial intelligence, gene editing. These are all ethical questions that are going to come back to this. But perhaps, most importantly, we have to ask these questions because we still haven't solved questions that we think we might have. It was an interview last month that Mullah Nuruddin Tarabi, one of the Taliban's top leaders and newly appointed head of prisons in Afghanistan, announced that amputations and executions are back on the table. Perhaps instead of public stadiums, he said, they might be shared on social media. But this is the problem. With people who say that morality and ethics are simply what God says, what do you say to somebody who thinks that way? After all, that was his answer in this news interview. We will follow Islam and we'll make our laws on the Quran. It's amazing to me how quickly Afghanistan has been bumped out of the front page by other news. But we're seeing lived out in real time right now the dangers of linking morality to religious beliefs, to Scripture. Over and over, the Taliban and its leaders are clear. They're just following what God's moral vision is. And women are the ones who are suffering most under this vision. Last month, when high schools reopened after the Taliban took over the country, only boys were allowed to return to the classroom. Don't worry, the Taliban said. Girls will be allowed an education in accordance with Sharia law. And last week, the Taliban told Kabul's female city employees, don't return to work next week. They're waiting to implement new policies that will allow these women to work in their government jobs in accordance with Sharia law. Repeatedly, this has been what they've said. The Taliban has told the people of Afghanistan and the world, do not worry. Women will receive full and equal rights in accordance with Sharia law. Women, in other words, will be treated morally and ethically as they believe God commands. Because God for them is the source of morality, and it's their particular understanding of God. And that's the problem, the danger with linking ethics to a religious belief, to what God says. How can you tell somebody that their moral values are wrong when you claim your moral values in the same way? Simply a different book, perhaps, or a different interpretation of the same book. It doesn't get any easier as Jews having that conversation. We might base our moral values in the same book, but there's so many different interpretations of it. We can't even agree on moral answers within a movement, let alone between the different Jewish denominations. And that's the problem, because moral absolutism based in Scripture quickly dilutes to moral relativism. We all have a different book or a different interpretation as the ultimate source of moral value. And that's the question in our parsha. How can we know what is morally true or false, what is right or wrong, if it's not just what God says? Is there a way? I think the parsha is actually very clear on it. Abraham had the audacity to question what God said. God tells him that the city of Sodom is wicked and will be destroyed. Since God said it, one would assume it's the ethical result, the ethical action for their deeds. that the punishment must fit the crime. Yet Abraham had the audacity to question it. He asks, "Will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty?" And then one of the most important lines in the Torah, Abraham demands of God, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat." Will not the judge of all the earth act justly? It's a bold statement. Abraham morally condemns God's choice and demands that God too act ethically. But what is his source for ethics? It's not the Torah. It's not what God said. It's something he innately knows. And he gets through argument and reason. Abraham, it seems, is aware of some moral code beyond the Torah, one that even God is subject to. Later on in our parsha, when God commands Abraham to offer his own son as a sacrifice, the story of the Akedah, he goes along willingly. This is perhaps one of the best examples people can cite in the Torah for why what God says is moral is moral. Abraham did it. He passed the test, right? That's how many in our tradition understand the story. Well, while many rabbis have read this story as a test of his faith, a test that he passed, I want to tell you it's actually a test of his ethics, a test that Abraham failed. Vayera hamakom merahok. So the Torah tells us, Abraham saw the place from afar. It's how the Torah describes when he reaches the bottom of the mountain, about to take his son up. Hamakom, or the place, is actually another name for God. And Rabbi Yehuda Arya Alter of Ger, known as the Safat Emet, a Hasidic rabbi and Rebbe who lived in the second half of the 19th century, he taught that this verse actually has another meaning. It's not that he saw the place from afar. He saw God from afar. His decision to listen blindly, to not argue with God, to not do what he knew was right, but to simply act without thinking, because God told him, because the Torah told him, that pushed him far from God. And while many commentators note that after this incident, Abraham and Isaac's relationship seems forever changed, the Torah doesn't talk about them speaking after this. If you notice, the same is actually true of Abraham and God. Abraham, the man that God entered in a covenant with, the man that God picked to be his prophet, to go forth and start a new nation, the man that God constantly spoke with, the man who not only was allowed to argue with divine morality, but whose challenges changed God's judgment. Never again does God speak to him after the incident with his son. He failed the test. Anybody who looks to religion blindly as the basis for moral values fails this test. I'm not saying there isn't wisdom, important ethical wisdom in our tradition, but it's in the way it's interpreted. Anybody who looks to religion blindly fails this test. And today the Taliban may be the most blatant example of this moral failure, but there are plenty of others. We see it in places where Christians are trying to place their own moral truth on others. And I'm ashamed to admit that there are Jewish examples throughout history as well. The truth is that anyone, any person, any religious leader, even any rabbi who claims that morality and ethics are based in Scripture solely, that what God says, without argument, without thinking, is automatically morally right or wrong, is part of the problem, not the solution. If you can't condemn unequivocally, not in practice, stoning adulterers, but in theory, it's part of the problem. If you can't condemn unequivocally, not just in practice, but in principle, that death is the wrong punishment, is not moral for people who are gay, for people who steal, for all sorts of other biblical crimes where it is commanded, you are part of the problem. It must be condemned not just in practice, but in principle. Because after all, We are not known as the children of Abraham. We are B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, the children of the one who wrestled with God. We live in a world today that's growing increasingly small, and we must be able to talk about morality and ethics across religious and cultural boundaries. We must be able to have meaningful conversations and discussions about right and wrong, good and evil. And those discussions, if we're going to have them with others, they cannot rely simply on our religious beliefs. We must find another argument, another way to discuss them using reason and rationality. Shabbat Shalom.